To model the use of taxes in our supply and demand, very simple model, we have to answer a couple of questions. So, how is the price, the equilibrium price affected? How is the equilibrium quantity affected? As Patricia suggested earlier on, who bears the burden of the tax? Basically, who pays for it, whether they are consumers or producers. And for the welfare analysis, how are consumer and producer surplus affected? So we will answer the 4 of these questions in today's class. So the effect of any tax, basically what it does is that when you introduce a tax to the market, and for this, we will basically focus on like sales type taxes. Basically, you create 2 prices. A price paid by consumers, which is the final price they see at the store, that includes taxes, and the actual price received by producers or suppliers that they receive. The difference, which is smaller, the difference between these is the tax paid to the government. Because obviously, you pay a final price that includes a tax, but the suppliers don't receive that amount of money. They receive a smaller amount, and that is what the tax charges, and the government receives that part. So when we take this into a model, what we see is this thing. So this is our normal supply and demand model, in which we have an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. And what happens is that the moment you introduce a tax, as it shows in the graph, that $T, that amount of cents or dollars or whatever it is, pesos, that you have to pay to the government through taxes, that is the difference between the price paid by the consumers and the price paid by the suppliers or the producers. So the tax essentially can be drawn as a shift of the supply curve. Because what happens with the price for overall consumers? It increases. It's like if the cost would be higher, and if the cost of something are higher, the supply curve shifts to the left, shifts upwards to the left, as in the picture. So as you can see in the 2 blue dots near the equilibrium point, and I'm going to actually draw for this, what you see from this point and from this point is the difference between the price paid by consumers and the price paid by producers. So this is AT. So what happens is that because final consumers face a higher price, PD, obviously that affects the quantity they want to demand. And because the price is higher, they will demand a smaller quantity than what the normal without tax equilibrium quantity would have been. That is pretty self-explanatory. Consumers face a higher price, therefore they will demand less. But what happens is that because they demand less, the overall sales that producers have obviously are smaller. So the sales they have are this whatever the consumers wanted to buy, but for those sales, instead of receiving the original equilibrium price, suppliers only receive this price, for which they had to pay some taxes. They had basically some of that overall final price was taxes, and the difference was the actual price paid or received by suppliers. Therefore, this difference in the tax creates a distortion, because the amount of money you're receiving as the seller of a good is smaller than what your actual consumers are having to pay for it. And therefore, you're getting affected in the overall volume of sales with some extra cost that you have no control over because it's something imposed by the government. And you have to satisfy with less sales than what you could have sold in the normal equilibrium point here, because of the government and this idea of the taxes. So what happens is that because there's a difference between what one group pays and what the other receives, and that affects the overall volume of sales, every time, recall from last class, every time the overall volume of sales is negatively affected, you have a deadweight loss. And that triangle is a deadweight loss. So as I put in the note on the slide, the easiest way to think about a tax, because you could technically move either the supply or the demand curve to basically represent a specific tax, is just to create a wedge. Let me draw again. It's just to create a wedge between what is the price paid by um, consumers and the price received by suppliers. That difference is literally the tax rate, and this is the deadweight loss. So you could calculate the deadweight loss in a welfare analysis example this way, because as you can see now, the consumer surplus is smaller than what it would have been in the original equilibrium with the pinkish oranges dots, or that form that triangle, and also the producer surplus is smaller than what it would have been with the more like the bigger triangle also made by the pinkish oranges um, dots. Questions regarding how to model, or basically the use of taxes in our model. In the appendix of the lecture note labeled Market Failures and Policy Interventions, I believe there is a very detailed process on how to actually calculate the equilibrium for these cases, and then the welfare analysis. And as we can see that from this slide, this is basically the blue and purple rectangles are the tax being paid by consumers and the tax being paid by producers or buyers and sellers. And the sum of those two taxes, or those two sections, is actually the government's revenue. And think about it. The tax is not just a tax per unit. It's the amount of money that the demanders had to pay for all the units they bought, QT, and times whatever that tax is, and that creates a rectangle. And the same thing happens for the suppliers. The amount of money they had to pay in taxes is for all the units they sold, QT, how much they had to pay for each unit. And that multiplication gives you also a rectangle. The moment you add them up, you find out the government's budget or the government's revenue from this particular tax or this particular situation. And that's more or less this idea of who pays the tax and who pays for this burden. Let me show you the next graph. Yes, this one. So if the above triangle is the consumer surplus, the lower triangle is the smaller producer surplus, and the remaining part is the tax, and the white triangle in between these blue and orange points is the deadweight loss. Well, through this, all the welfare analysis that we need to understand everything. We know the amount of money that now consumers are receiving through the consumer surplus, the amount of money that the producers are earning through the producer surplus, the amount of money the government is obtaining through taxes, their budget, which is that green triangle, and the amount of money that deadweight loss. This is the graph I want to show you. Remember that taxes increase the price paid by consumers, and they reduce the price received by producers, the PD and the PS. Therefore, they have to reduce the quantity offered in the market. As the final price is higher, less people want to buy it. And every time this happens, you create deadweight loss. I want to stress this out because taxes all the time create deadweight loss. The point is that you can still use some taxes to minimize other deadweight losses, and we will see that. I'm not sure if later today, definitely if not, at the beginning of next class. But remember that the government tends to do a lot of things with taxes, so that's important that they generate budget. We've discussed that they can do infrastructure projects, they can pay social programs, they can do a bunch of stuff. And that's important because they tend to create other welfare through that situations, where they are because they're redistributing policies or redistribution policies, or because they are paying for something that is needed, like security, or like in these times of pandemics environments, they're paying for, I don't know, like something related to the health industry or the health services. So Perfect. Obviously they are basically receiving some form of income and taking it away from us, but they're doing certain stuff. Whether that is a net positive for society, rather than a net negative in terms of they're taking money away from you, but they're doing something with it, completely depends on how the government is spending those resources. Because there's nothing free in real life. There's always someone that has to pay for this program, for this service, for this product, for everything that you see in life, someone had to pay for that. So because that is the case, every time we give some of our resources to the government through taxes, we should expect something in return, some service, some infrastructure project, something that they're doing with those resources. Depending on the quality of the government, that differs, and you may have more deadweight losses than what you should have incurred, or less than what you should have incurred. And the point is that every transfer is not only a transfer of money to someone else, but there's also a net negative in terms of the deadweight losses creation. So that's why if we have to incur in these deadweight losses through the levying of taxes, then the government should be doing the best they can with those resources to compensate for that and better off society, or at least the most vulnerable people of society. So there's always a segment there's always a higher price, PD, because of the tax, as we see here, regarding to the equilibrium price, P star. But the size of the rectangles and who pays for the consumer tax or the producer side of the tax depends on the elasticities. As you literally see in this graph, the more inelastic a good is, basically the steeper the demand curve is, the higher the share of the tax that is being absorbed by consumers. See how the rectangle paid by the producers has become smaller in this slide than in the previous one. Also, the rectangle paid by consumers, the above rectangle, is now bigger once the demand has become more inelastic, or less own price elastic, which is the same thing. If there is a perfectly inelastic type good in which you are so desperate for some product that you would almost buy it at any price, the entire tax burden falls on the consumers. That is really important because governments know this. And because governments know this, they know how to tax and what type of products to tax. It's simpler to tax consumers than to tax producers. Because if you tax producers, you affect their earnings. And when you affect their earnings, some of them could go broke and they have to fire people, and has a much greater consequences than levying taxes on a bunch of millions of consumers. So they tend, one of the type of taxes that I did not show you in the different categories because of simplicity and because of time, are what in Mexico is called IEPS type tax. And those are special type taxes. They come in different types of varieties, but they basically are taxes on the consumption of special things like cigarettes or alcohol or sugar-based drinks, or a bunch of things that are very inelastic. And because they're very inelastic, they know that consumers will actually pay a lot of that tax. So because they will absorb most of the burden, they want less people to consume them. They want less people to smoke. They want less people to basically drink alcohol, so that there are not so many alcoholic people. Less people want them, the government wants less people to consume sugar-based drinks because of our obesity problem. Some of those taxes are better than others in terms of the overall effect on the health side of things. But the theory behind them is just the one being described in this slide. That the more inelastic a good is, the higher the burden that consumers have to pay for it. And therefore, the more it will affect technically the overall quantity they would want to buy. And that's a little bit the idea of why this becomes the way it is. If they want to levy more taxes, they have to levy taxes on more inelastic type goods. Questions? This is a quick recap of the idea of government revenue, and I'm basically finishing the idea of taxes here. This is a quick recap of what literature has considered the most efficient taxes in terms of like creating the less deadweight loss. And these are a couple of things that I hope you can remember for your future, in the sense that when like you hear politicians talking about different tax policies and like different tax reforms and stuff like that the governments tend to discuss every so often. That well, you want to basically levy the simplest taxes as possible, and consumption taxes tend to be the simplest ones in terms of administrative type costs. Therefore, they're very good because they're much more inescapable. When you buy the good, there are two sides of the transaction. So if the tax is leave it on one side of the transaction, you can see if some other people are not wanting to pay their taxes, and that's why it's so important to basically the idea of the receipts or the las facturas, that inelastic goods should receive higher taxes because more people you can levy more money that way, and it affects less the overall quantity sold because of how inelastic those goods are. But it discourages people to buy that because it affects their consumption more. Obviously, higher taxes or higher sales taxes on luxury goods because they will be paid by richer people. So the overall effect on society is smaller because they have more money, so they can pay it. And this is also the idea behind progressive taxes, that you levy less taxes on people that have less money than they that needed it most to like survive, and you levy more taxes from wealthier people that can and will can survive without those resources.